I'm Professor David Wilson. As a criminologist, I'm often asked, what's it like to interview a serial killer?
This is a tape-recorded interview. Date is 11/17/84.
In this new series, I'm going to take you on a journey into the dark heart of the police interrogation room. Using cutting-edge lip-sync technology, we'll bring to life the actual taped confessions of some of the world's most notorious murderers.
Put that pillowcase or whatever it was, like cushion cover over her head.
And bring you face to face with evil.
Put her into the sleeping bag. No, I just slung her in the corner.
And along with forensic psychologist Professor Michael Brooks, I will analyse their interviews in unparalleled detail.
And while he was asleep, I put a noose around his neck. I throttled him with the noose and he hardly struggled.
Like the police detectives who interviewed them, you'll experience firsthand their cold and calculating minds.
I've never got on with my mum. I knew that she favoured my sister more than me.
Their wicked words, now seen being spoken for the very first time, will never be forgotten.
The Hawkins girl's head was severed and taken up the road about 25 to 50 yards.
In countries that still have the death penalty, a number of serial murderers will choose to confess to the police, only because they want to save their own skins. In today's episode, we examine the confessions of one such man who entered a plea bargain to avoid the executioner's chair. One of the most prolific serial killers in American history, he was charged with the murder of 49 women in a killing cycle that lasted from 1982 to 1998. Dubbed the Green River Killer, he dumped many of the bodies of his victims along the waterway that runs through Washington state. The confessions are particularly interesting for the techniques employed by the American interrogators. In the UK, detectives employ what's known as the PEACE model. It's an acronym: prepare and plan, engage and explain, account, close, evaluate. However, in the United States, they deploy what's known as the READ technique. This is very different from the PEACE model and is in effect an accusatory process. The investigator, in essence, tells the suspect that they know that he committed the crime. Often this can simply become good cop, bad cop. Observe closely in particular how King County Sheriff Dave Reichart, now an American congressman, seems to befriend the murderer and put him at ease as the good police officer would, only to then turn on him when he believes he's lying, becoming the quintessential bad cop. So who is the killer we get up close and personal with today in the police interview room? Gary Ridgway. In 2001, Washington State Police arrested Gary Ridgway on suspicion of murder. Ridgway's DNA had been found on the body of a dead woman. Within hours, he'd be accused of many more murders. With death by execution awaiting him for his crimes, he decided to bargain for his life, offering revelations about the whereabouts of the bodies of many other victims, all of whom he had buried along the Green River in Washington state. King County Sheriff Dave Reichardt had long pursued the murderer. And now the killer and the cop were about to face off in an extraordinary interview.
Morning. Morning. You know, why don't we take his chains off for a minute? Gary and I are just going to have a visit for a couple of minutes, sir. Got you chained up pretty good there, don't they?
Yes, I do.
Must be concerned about whether or not you're thinking about running off, huh? Mm-hmm. You wouldn't do that, would you?
No.
Gary Ridgway, in many ways, was a very normal man, a very ordinary man. He worked in a body shop for some 30 years. And nothing unusual about him, very ordinary, down-to-earth chap. Except he liked killing.
Question might be asked is, why is this church-going, on the face of it, religious man, and family and friendly and neighbourly, how is he killing prostitutes? Why is he treating them like dirt? Why is he abusing their corpses in such a terrible way? I believe that behind the mask was a monster. Outside, I think he probably was. He believed he was a church-going man, but he had this beast inside him that surfaced every now and then to kill. I think he killed because he enjoyed it. He enjoyed treating these women like trash and dumping their body like so much garbage once he'd used them and abused them. To fully understand Ridgway, it would be a good exercise to close your eyes and listen to his voice. Listen to how normal he is. Can you sense a beast in that voice? Because that is a man that could have been living next door to you.
And I choked her to death. Then I took my socks off and got them in a knot and tied them around her neck and tied them as tight as I could. And so she raised her head up, and that's when I put my arm around her, my right arm, and started choking her. But I thought I was doing you guys a favor. Killing prostitutes, here, you guys can't control them, but I can.
In the confession itself, he actually steps up and tries to present himself in a much more matey, heroic type of role. We see him offering to be helpful to the police. We see Gary Ridgway trying to position himself as one of the good guys, as a hero. You guys can't control these prostitutes, but I can. Which suggests to me we're not dealing with somebody who is psychopathic in the traditional sense, but rather somebody who has learnt these very disruptive behaviour patterns, these very disruptive relationship patterns from his early days.
He's one of a long line of killers, a God-fearing character who seemed to believe that by killing prostitutes, he was ridding this world of evil people. He created the perfect recipe for serial murder by picking victims who were prostitutes, who a lot of people didn't really care about, and some might not even be noticed that they'd gone missing. So that gave him a safe environment in which to kill. And we mustn't forget, he killed dozens and dozens of people.
He was successful for many years, killing women, and what he did was literally leave them by the river, hence the Green River Killer as he was known. Rivers are very good places to dispose of bodies because they rot quite quickly. They have the water washing all the forensic evidence away. We found that when the police did start finding the bodies, that they were decomposed, which made it very difficult for the police to even identify many of the victims for some time. he did that because he knew enough about crime to know the best way to avoid detection. What he did was just very methodically kill and dispose. Most people, if they kill, they don't think about disposal. He clearly disposed on the river where he was comfortable. Killers like to work where they're comfortable.
He didn't strike as being particularly intelligent, but he had a kind of cunning, manipulative capacity in him as well. That certainly was an aspect of that. The flat affect, the absence of any emotion, any sign of contrition that I saw when I looked at one of the tapes of the confession was striking and frightening.
And I choked her.
From the moment Ridgway sat down to be interviewed, it was clear he wanted himself to be perceived as a man who was on a self-ordained mission to rid the streets of sex workers. However, I believe his motivations are far more sadistic, and I'm here with forensic psychologist Professor Michael Brooks to explore what drove Ridgway.
And so she raised her head up, and that's when I put my arm around her, my right arm, and started choking her. But I thought I was doing you guys a favor. Killing prostitutes here, you guys can't control them, but I can.
So Michael, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer.
A substantial serial killer who's now claiming 70 to 80. That's highly significant.
And I, as a criminologist, would call him a mission serial killer, because what about this line that he says to Dave Reichart, the interviewer? He says, "I thought I was doing you guys a favor. You can't control them, but I can." He's on some kind of self-appointed mission to rid the streets of sex workers.
It's certainly a purposeful killing for a reason. So mission would be one good way of describing it, wanting to erase from the US, from the state, sex workers.
A key to Ridgway's success as a serial killer was his banality and ability to integrate killing into his everyday life.
Many serial killers live alone with their mothers. They're often the peculiar person. They have quirky habits. Gary Ridgway had a family. He looked on the surface like someone that basically no one would point the finger at as being a serial killer.
His life is the American dream gone wrong, but it's also a Jekyll and Hyde existence. It's maintaining a happy family life, a nice home, a nice car, an environment that appears to be all American. And yet, at the same time, there's this twisted, dark side to him that brought him to this place where he felt it was totally okay to go out and kill innocent women.
He's a Jekyll and Hyde character. Behind the mask of normality is a monster. A sick, sadistic killer that not only his only family wouldn't have known about it. He's that cunning and crafty. So he can go to church or barbecue on a Sunday afternoon and then make an excuse to go out for an hour and kill and come home as if nothing had happened at all.
And even his own family would be used to help create the perfect cover for his crimes.
My son was there and I killed her. I'm real sure my son didn't see it.
Gary Ridgway is suspected of having killed many more victims, and the true figure may never be known. His almost robotic recitation of his crimes reveals that he was process-focused, enjoying the time that he had with his victims to determine when they would die. The appalling self-justification he has for murdering innocent women is also a chilling reminder that even when serial killers confess, They remain proud of their crimes and determined to take some of their secrets with them to the grave. Perhaps the most disturbing fact of all about Ridgway was that he wasn't just content with killing his victims, he also wanted to violate them, even in death. This was a chilling fact that serial killer Ted Bundy would alert detectives to many years earlier when they turned to him for advice on how to trap the Green River Killer.
Well, first of all, he's trying to dispose of the bodies where they won't be found. This guy doesn't want to get caught. I think it's clear that over time you can see him, at least it would appear, that over time he's trying to improve his dump sites. He's trying to get better at disposing of his bodies.
Bundy was killing in the same area, the Pacific Northwest. He had enough knowledge about the areas to give advice, and he actually did give sensible advice because he knew the kind of framework that Gary Ridgway was working in. It takes one to know one almost, and he was very good at doing that.
An offender who will have sex with a dead body is typically these are offenders who are much more mentally disturbed than I actually think Gary Ridgway is. So it's quite unusual for us to find this behaviour in this kind of individual. Because for me, Gary Ridgway isn't profoundly psychopathic. Gary Ridgway is simply somebody who has learned a very exploitative pattern of interpersonal relationships. So the going back to visit the dead bodies, I find quite surprising.
During his police interviews, Ridgway would claim that his morbid and twisted fascination with sex and death could be traced back to the relationship he had had with his mother, whom he claimed had domineered and belittled him.
She was the big problem I had. I mean, there was my dad wasn't around that much. He was working all the time, and she was the one that was in control, and she was constantly trying to get me to do better in school, and I just couldn't do better. I wanted to have her stop, and the only way was to kill her, to hurt her bad. Angry at her for pushing on me to remember, and I just couldn't remember, and I just wanted her to stop.
I mean, it's almost a cliche, the way in which he refers back to his relationship with his mother to try and justify what he's done. But it's a cliche for a reason. It's a very important initial relationship for a man, for a boy, for a man. And clearly there was something very wrong in the relationship Gary Ridgway had with his mother, a very distorted relationship that has produced the murderer that he became.
In my head, I don't know what I would do. I just wanted her to stop. One time there, they were going to put me in a special school. I didn't want that. My dad and my mom were arguing about it all the time. And it was for retarded people, and I wasn't retarded, I don't think. So I was mad at them for wanting to put me away from other kids. And wanting to hurt her. And hurt her bad.
Clearly he hated his mother for whatever reason, whether she rejected him, whether she was too controlling of him, things like that. He doesn't actually explain why he hated his mother, but clearly he hated his mother. And has that behaviour then been projected onto all women. And again, prostitutes are seen very much as fallen women, as women of disrespect. Is he projecting his disrespect of his mother onto prostitutes? Strangulation is very much about control. It's a very personalised way of killing somebody. You really do have their life in your hands, and that's both enjoyable and frightening.
Ridgway was now trying to take control of the interviews and explain his evolution as a serial killer, something he claimed could be traced back to his earliest acts of juvenile delinquency.
During that thing, I usually took it out on other things instead of hurting her. Living things, killing animals. I stabbed a kid one time. Stabbed a kid with a knife. Down by Chinook, where I used to go to school. And boy was playing, I stabbed him in the side. And didn't kill him. And I think it must have been about 6th grade, I think it was 7th grade. And that was at the same time I was breaking out windows, throwing rocks at windows. But that's what I took my aggression on. I couldn't take it on my mom. I had to take it on my animals. And I killed a lot of birds, but one cat suffocated it in a ice chest. And shot babies at dogs to hurt them, and threw rocks at my brother about that time. I think I was getting out of that though.
It's a kind of element of a learning curve of trial and error in terms of being able to vent that dysfunctional, unresolved conflict in him, that anger, that frustration, that inadequacy on the relatively innocent victims as he progresses through this kind of hierarchy of victim. He can't satisfy his sexual frustration on them, but he can satisfy that need to dominate, control, and destroy. And I think that's a real drive with him, that need to destroy.
Yet perhaps the turning point for Ridgway came when his hatred for his mother began to manifest itself as a sexual desire for her.
I'd see her out sunbathing, and I feel that she would be good to have sex with, but she's my mother, and I never, This is the only woman in my life, other than neighborhood girls, but so I get fantasies of having sex with her, and wanting to, but being restricted on that part.
He reports, and we don't know if it's true or not, but he reports kind of a sexualized relationship with his mother, which he found both appealing and at the same time revolted by it. He doesn't quite understand the sexuality of what's going on, but he knows that he doesn't really understand it and doesn't really like it, and it makes him uncomfortable. And in some ways, that probably scarred him for the rest of his life.
She was there sunbathing and tan, and it was a something that really intrigued me. She didn't even know I was there. No, I stared and looked out all the time, gliding together in my head when she was just laying down there. She was more of a sex object than a mother, and I loved the part of her being a sex object, but I didn't like the part of her being a mother.
For a son to be talking about his mother sunbathing and to be talking about his mother as a sexual object is clearly not a healthy sign. So his inability to see his mother in any other terms was a precedent for the way he then went on to view all women as some kind of as objects there and available for his gratification solely.
As Ridgway's urge to kill increased, he incorporated it seamlessly into the fabric of his everyday life.
This guy was able to factor in his appetite for murder and combine it with his everyday life as a so-called responsible father, to the degree that he even picked his son up from school, went and found a victim, left the car, killed the victim, and came back and drove off with his son still in the back of the car.
And I picked up a woman on back highway, and Matthew was next to me in the seat, and she hopped in, and I took her over to in the south airport area, and took her into an area, and my son was there, and I killed her. I'm real sure my son didn't see it, but that only happened one time.
A great deal of confidence on his part that he can actually get, or maybe a very strong drive, and probably it's a bit of both. He has a drive to kill, he's got the confidence to kill and come straight back. It also gives him quite a good alibi. He's got the car, he's got his son in the car, he's taking his son for a drive, he's out for a few minutes, he doesn't have to account for that time.
Let's say she's always in the car, we're driving down the road, and she wants to see my ID. So I whip out my ID, I put my finger over my driver's license to hide my name. Opposite side was pictures. And a picture of my son. See my son, and they would know I was probably a normal person.
A sad, appalling aspect of a psychopath's capacity to use and manipulate even those that most of us would find we most need to protect and nurture.
Gary Ridgway uses his son as bait to entice women and to then subsequently murder them. And in fact, there are examples where he murders the women in the presence of his son. All he's doing here is playing out the relationship he had with his mother. It's a really very clear example of the repetition of relationships through the generations that we're seeing here, I think. To be using his son as part of what he's doing just speaks to me of the depth of his emotional unhealthiness.
Took her into an area, and my son was there, and I killed her. I'm real sure my son didn't see it, but that only happened one time.
He even reveals that on one occasion, he brings his son home from some kind of game, and his son is in the truck, and he leaves his son in the truck and goes and kills someone. Now, is that to provide a perfect alibi? Does it give him greater thrill knowing that his son is there? What's going on there in your view?
Well, not necessarily. So he's on a mission. He knows what he wants to do. I would speculate that this is planned. He knew that that person would be there and took advantage of the situation to eliminate her.
It was part of the fabric of his life. He got into a habit He got into a habit that was deadly, obviously, for his victims. And I don't think towards the end of his reign, if you want to call it that, he gave it much thought. It was like an addiction. You know, it was like, instead of going to the bar and having a bottle of beer, he'd go out and find a woman to murder.
After 3 days of questioning by Reichardt, Ridgway eventually confessed and then agreed to take the police on a field trip to the grave sites of 3 of his victims. However, there are dangers in all of this. Many killers get huge satisfaction from doing this kind of crooks tour, amongst them Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, who led police across Saddleworth Moor. The killers believe it gives them power over the authorities, and they gain a sick satisfaction from visiting the sites of what they consider to be their greatest achievement, but which the police have been unable to uncover. Ridgway was arrested by police at his workplace and was initially uncooperative until Ridgway realized he was facing the death penalty and so started to talk to the police.
I agreed to plead guilty to the counts that I committed, not any others.
Serial killers know when they're caught because the evidence is so clear-cut. Once the evidence is clear-cut, then most of them will end up omitting some of it, but they don't tell you about the ones you don't know. And they keep those because that gives them still a sense of power and control. And that's what it's all about. And that's the game.
He was able, through the kind of reluctant negotiation process with them, because he had information they needed, to use that to prolong that process whereby he was the center of attention, and that fueled that need in him to feel special, to feel something more than he was, which was an inadequate, banal nobody.
Ridgway would take the police to the locations where some of his victims were buried. But when confronted by the reality of his crimes, Ridgway would try to play the facts down to make him seem less inhuman.
And then I got to thinking the families would like to know where their daughters are buried and how they died.
It all sounds so normal, so ordinary. It doesn't sound like the voice of a monster, but it's the banality of evil. And it's probably more scary and more terrifying and more cold-blooded to listen to him talking in these terms than if he talked to them in a more emotional state. And then we have Ridgway's ability to perform the role of a multiple serial killer. Because once he's made his confessions, he's then taken down to the scene of his many crimes with a big group of police officers, forensic experts, judges, everyone. They come down with him and he's there. He's at the center of all this and he's loving every minute of it. He's got the fame that perhaps he'd always wanted to have, even though it's for the most twisted reason. During one of the trips, Ridgway revealed the remains of several victims. But he had buried many more dead women along the riverbanks and either couldn't or wouldn't reveal where they were.
This kind of outing is not uncommon among serial killers. It is, if you like, a way of them getting out of the cells, getting away from that confinement, and giving them almost a sense of purpose and power in leading the inquiry. There you have many, many officers, serious crime officers, who are being led by a serial killer to wherever that person thinks he may want to take them.
And so that means you and I have stood in some of the same places.
I think we stood in every place.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
That's pretty coincidental, I guess you would call it. You know, because you were on one side and I was on their side.
Yeah.
And where I killed him, you were the one who recovered.
Yeah. I've been working on this case a long time.
So you have a little bit of gray hairs?
Do you think so?
And then I got to thinking the families would like to know where their daughters are buried and how they died.
And what about the field trip, Michael? How big a danger is it to allow a serial killer that's as controlled and organized as Ridgway to take him back, as it were, to show the police where he may have disposed of other bodies?
Well, this is always a difficult one, isn't it? Because the families would like to know where their missing children or missing relatives are so that they can give them a proper burial and a decent funeral and a proper farewell. So you've got trying to meet the needs of the victims' families on the one hand, and against the publicity and the control that you're then giving to the offender, and that he's dominating those proceedings. So how many bodies are actually found when you take an offender to search for a missing relative?
There's another twist to this, because when he is down on those riverbanks with these big crowds of policemen and forensic experts, examining the sites where these poor women had been murdered, evidence emerges that he had necrophiliac relationships with the bodies after they were killed, and even revisited these crime scenes on a number of occasions. He denied this categorically. It was almost as if it was a step too far. Within his twisted world, it was fine for him to murder and rape and create the most awful fear and trepidation in huge communities through these actions. But to then be accused of being the ultimate sick and twisted killer who came back to his victims to have sex with the bodies was just a step too far for even him to admit.
Gary Ridgway was a coward and a bully and a sexual sadist, but when faced with losing his own life, all he could do was tell the truth. That would save his skin.
With Ridgway heading for a life behind bars, Sheriff David Reichardt confronts the killer in one final showdown. What follows is a masterclass in many aspects of the Reed technique, with Reichardt dominating Ridgway, refusing to accept his lies and condemning him as a serial murderer long before he even appeared in court.
What would you like for lunch?
Just a Big Mac and fries.
It's certainly an impressive in the sense that it is a very gentle, guided interaction. It's not an inquisitional interview at all. In fact, it's a kind of reassuring on your terms, which obviously connects with that kind of ego need that he had.
Sheriff Dave Reichardt was a highly experienced investigator who had worked through every detail of the case. Now that the killer was before him, he was about to use all the skills in his arsenal to extract as much information from Ridgway as he could. And this would see him shifting between playing the good cop and the bad cop.
You and I can be enemies or we can be buddies. That's your choice. If you want to keep lying to me, we can be enemies. What are you going to do?
You're not holding anything back.
Oh, I think you are. I think you are. You know,
I'm not holding anything back. You know, we got those small things that
can you really look me in the eye and tell me that you're not holding something back?
I haven't been, I've been thinking about.
You're waiting. Your eyes are going back and forth.
Well, I've been trying to.
Look me in the eye and say, Sheriff, I'm not lying to you.
I'm not lying to you.
Yes, you are.
No.
You're Gary. You're lying. You're a serial killer. That's what serial killers do.
Some interest with Ridgway's case is the fact that at some point during the Green River killing investigations, he was actually pulled in and questioned, and he was given a polygraph test, which he passed with flying colours. This happens quite a lot with serial killers because they do not have a conscience. The fact that they've been asked awkward questions, it doesn't even raise their blood pressure one bit. Their heartbeats don't move. They don't even sweat like anybody else would when they're lying on a machine.
You and I can be enemies or we can be buddies. That's your choice. If you want to keep lying to me, we can be enemies. What are you going to do?
I'm not lying to you. Yes, you are. You're a serial killer. That's what serial killers do.
One of the things that we do in this country is that we have the police are trained in a particular way to interview, and it's called the peace model. And what we hear Dave Reichert describing are the Reid techniques. And I'm not so certain that the Reid technique was particularly successful there.
No, because he didn't build up a sufficient relationship, or at least Gary Ridgway didn't allow him to actually begin to fully explain everything that he'd done.
And at the heart of building up that relationship is this need to build rapport. Could somebody like Ridgway ever allow himself to be able to be convinced by a police officer or indeed a forensic psychologist to establish a relationship where there is rapport?
My view would be that such an individual always wants to be in control, so they will always seek to give a little information if that's what they want to, but they'll always want to hold something back.
And in fact, we should be surprised that somebody as controlling as Ridgway was prepared to speak at all. So all credit to Reichert for getting the information that he got.
But this could all be part of the game that Gary Ridgway was playing. I will give you a little bit and leave you wanting more.
So if you had Gary Ridgway here now in front of you, what would be your strategy for interviewing him?
I don't think I'd want to engage too much in an interview with him unless he wanted to talk. So I'd simply ask him, what is it that you want to share with us? Because otherwise you're then getting into his game.
On December 18, 2003, Ridgway was sentenced to 48 life sentences with no possibility of parole. His plea bargain had spared him from being executed. He's believed to have murdered close to 100 women. Many of their bodies still lie in unmarked graves along the Green River.
The fact that he confessed in order to get a plea bargain is absolutely typical of this kind of individual. What he's learnt from a very young age is that the world is there, that other people are there simply for him to abuse, exploit, coerce. That's what his relationships are all about.
Here is a man who I think was consciously attempting to make himself special in the gratification of his need for sex, this obsessional need for sex. There are many people who have an obsessional need for sex, but he also had the inadequacy and the flat affect and the lack of a conscience, which allowed him to also experience that kind of power and control element that is an essential part of that equation.
Being a nobody in his real life and having this other half of him, which is now becoming somebody. He has now become known as the Green River Killer that the police have been hunting for years and years. Here they've got him. He is the Green River Killer. And yet the circus around him is getting bigger and bigger, and as that gets bigger and bigger, he becomes smaller and smaller, to the point where he is convicted and sentenced to multiple life prison sentences, and now Mr. So What is reduced to a short prison number on a prison wing in one of the toughest penitentiaries of the United States. He is now a Mr. Nobody again.